Yes. So we planted the church. So actually, I was here in San Jose for about 3 years. We planted from San Diego. So in 2010, we took a team of about 30 people from San Diego, moved to San Jose, planted Lighthouse San Jose. And then 2013, we took some people from San Jose and San Diego and planted a church in LA in 2013. And our church is, it's a very young church. It's mostly young families, a lot of babies, had a lot of COVID babies. So we have this like surge of children starting to grow up now. It's predominantly Asian American. We have some non-Asians as well. I guess the way I would describe it is it's not exclusively necessarily just for Asians, but it is focused on reaching that community. Obviously, as you know, we can identify and relate to them. It's predominantly Chinese or Taiwanese or various Chinese backgrounds. That was the interesting thing at each church plant. We started all Korean in San Diego. Like every single person was Korean. And then within a few years, became predominantly Chinese. I don't know why. Maybe
the Koreans?
Maybe they could sense I had issues or something. I don't know. No, I mean, there's still a good number of Korean folks too. I've always found it interesting that kind of. But anyone's welcome, and so yeah, we probably have about 80 adults and probably about like 30 children at the church, and we rent from a church in Glendale, right near the shopping area called Americana, Glendale Galleria, and so yeah, so most people are familiar with that, and yeah, so next year, our official 10-year anniversary will be next year, so yeah, by the grace of God, still alive and surviving. I guess I could give a little background since Dean mentioned I'll share a little bit about church planting. First of all, I never imagined myself being a church planter. Well, first of all, I never imagined myself being a pastor, period. I grew up as my dad wanted me to be a doctor like any Korean wanted, for their kids. So I went to UCLA with a bio major. Halfway through, that's when I met this Bible study, and I was serving on junior high staff just as a volunteer at Grace Church. So when I met all these friends, they were all helping the youth of their church. And they're like, oh, you're on staff. Can you come speak for our youth retreat? And I'm like, I'm not a pastor. I'm just a staff person. They're like, but you speak English. And that was enough to qualify me. So that first summer, I spoke at 6 retreats in a row. Whoa. It was crazy, but you're in college, you have energy, and summer we had time. And I think during that time is when God really, challenged my heart to say, you know what, this is the way in which I could serve. I saw such a great need at that time, and it was just the Korean church community, but my dad was adamantly opposed. He was still a young Christian. I think he still had hopes that I would turn out to be something worthwhile. But then all of a sudden, God just changed his heart. He went 1 week where he told me to quit. Like I was in the middle of a retreat, one of those 6 retreats. He told me to quit, and I was like, Dad, I have to finish. I'm actually in charge of this one retreat. And then 2 weeks later, he calls me back home and says, John, I want you to know that I'll support you fully. To go to seminary, to become a pastor. He said, I'll even go to seminary with you. And I was like, I'm not sure why he had to add that, but he actually did go to seminary later. He became a Greek scholar while he was still a full-time CPA. I don't know how he did it. And he was a professor at Azusa Pacific School of Theology for almost 20 years. And the only reason he stopped was because they removed Greek as a requirement. That was so sad. My dad was so sad. I mean, I was sad to hear, like, how could you remove Greek as a requirement for pastors? You need to study that. So he passed away in 2017. But that was a very life-changing moment for me, where now he, and my mom told me later she'd been praying for me to become a pastor all those years. She never told me that. And so I went into ministry. Like I shared, the first 11 years I was in a Korean church context. And the first one was really, it was just like an adventure because I was young. The church didn't know what to do with me, but they knew I loved their kids. They paid me $200 a month to be a youth pastor. And when I got married, they gave me a raise to $500. So I still had to work 3 other jobs as I was going to seminary. But it was okay because, I'm young, right? I mean, I'm like, I don't care. I just want to serve God. And I learned so much. And it actually was a wonderful time. The senior pastor was actually a very kind man and gave me a lot of room to do stuff that I probably would not have allowed someone to do. Went to Maryland because they had told me that they would launch me as a church planter after 3 years. And so that was the one thing that I didn't see happening at the church that I was at. So that's why I went. And so I went to help them start an English-speaking ministry just like I had done in LA. And the first 3 years were great. I just took all my, Southern California energy and just took it there. And they thought I was crazy and, but the church just grew. But then as we did work towards that, becoming independent, because that's what they had, the church plant, that's when I think the leadership of the Korean side, there were definitely factions about that. And when I gave my presentation to the church leadership one night, I got destroyed that night. I mean, I just got screamed and yelled at. And I just remember I was so in shock. You kind of expect some level of professionalism at an adult level, and this just turned into this. I mean, this guy was slandering me in front of everybody, and my senior pastor wouldn't defend me. My advisor was just silent, and I just thought, how could this be? And so my last year and a half there, things just kind of fell apart. My health fell apart, and my wife, who is like the strongest person I know, Angela, one day she broke down. Like, she never breaks down. Like, she never cries. I'm the one that cries all the time. And she broke down and she said, I'm watching you die because I can't handle this anymore. And that's when I was like, okay, if it was just me, I could just die. But I got to take care of my wife, and we had 2 daughters at the time, so I resigned. And I was pretty done. I did not want to be a pastor anymore. And all I could see was just everything was dark. So we moved to San Diego. And my brother-in-law, my wife, she has 2 younger brothers, and the older one was my roommate in college. And we had always dreamed about serving together. And he did serve with me at the Korean church, the first one in LA. He was very sad when I moved to Maryland. So when we moved to San Diego, he offered for us to stay with him. And I said, I'll accept under 2 conditions. Don't talk about church, and don't talk about planting a church. Okay. I knew that's what he would want to talk about. And I was like, don't. I said, I don't trust anyone. I don't even trust you. I had to apologize to him after that. It was terrible because he took us in, right? He actually not only took us in, he gave us I don't know what you call it. He gave us $400 a month to stay with him. It's like we didn't even pay rent. My wife and I had to look for jobs, so it was such a crazy time. But after about 3 months or so, that's when my wife, we were talking one day, and she's like, "Okay, you got to stop having this pity party." And she's very direct and very straightforward with me, and I'm like, she's like, "There's a group of people here who want you to actually start a church." She knew. And I was like, no, I'm not going to get burned again. I'm not going to stick my neck out again and get it chopped off. And she's like, we just let it go. Okay, things happened in the past. What can you do? But are you just going to hold on to that and let it define your life? And I knew she was right, but it took me a little while. And then I said, okay, we'll pray about it. And then my brother-in-law's family, and there's another family. So 3 of us. I said, okay, I'm willing to get together to pray for 3 months, and we'll meet every Wednesday night. I'll just share a devotional, and we'll have dinner together. And the most important part of that is we're going to have Mexican food every Wednesday night, because I miss the Mexican food. They didn't have Mexican food out in Maryland. You know, they said Taco Bell's Mexican food. I was like, that's not Mexican food. So I was more excited about the Mexican food. But then as we prayed, and I think God used those 2 families to really help heal my heart and to encourage me. So we prayed, and I said, okay, let's start an outreach Bible study that summer. And so we opened it up, and about like 15 people came. So I was like, oh, wow. Like, I didn't think anyone would come. Like, I mean, we're nobody. We have nothing. We have no money. We have no supporting church. But my brother-in-law had been very faithfully investing in people. And so by that December of 98, that's when we launched the Sunday service for Lighthouse Bible Church San Diego. And we had about like 30 people by that time. And I think, like I said, I never thought that that's what I would do. But from the get-go, we came up with something called the MVP, the Mission, Vision, Passion Statements. And our mission was to make disciples of Christ, Matthew 28, 18 to 20. Our vision is to plant churches, because I said the goal is not to build a big church. The goal is to be a church-planting church. And then the P is the passion, to love God and people, Matthew 22, 37 to 40. And Acts 1:8 was kind of the basis for our kind of the model of how we wanted to plant churches, like we saw in the book of Acts. So we started off, very modestly, but God was very gracious to then take that. And it took us about 10 years before we actually planted the first church. And that was because I came up to San Jose one year, met a bunch of pastors at a conference, and they were so sad. They were so beaten down, and they were telling me how hard ministry was here up in the Bay Area. And so at that time, and we had a bunch of college students who had come from the San Jose area to school in San Diego, like UCSD, San Diego State, and they got saved. And then they said, the churches up there don't teach the same things and don't have the same priorities that we're learning here. So we planted church in San Jose, and all I knew about San Jose was, I know it's Silicon Valley, and it's about an hour away from San Francisco. That's all I know. I don't know anything else. I know they have the Sharks. That's it. So, that time in San Jose was very impactful. And so on the drive back down with my family, so by that time I have 4 daughters, and my oldest is a junior in high school, a freshman in high school, a 5th grader, and a 4-year-old. So pretty widespread. And then my wife, we stopped at a Jack in the Box, and I said, okay, family meeting, what do you think about planting a church in San Jose? Okay, pros and cons. You tell me what you like about it, what you don't like. So it was kind of funny. They all were so for it. And I was really surprised, because we're living in San Diego. Okay? I mean, people go to San Diego to die. It's a wonderful place to die. You don't move to San Jose to die. No, maybe in other ways, I don't know. But a lot of retired folks in San Diego, right? So people are like, why would you leave San Diego? Like, this is like one of the nicest places to live. I said, well, the mission statement, Matthew 28, says, go. But what does go mean? Well, I think it means you don't just stay. You need to actually move somewhere and do something. So our elders let them know, and they were all for it. And so in 2009, we announced that we would plant a church in San Jose. It took about 1.5 years to prepare. I was hoping for 5 people to go, because I always told our church, it's not just a pastor, it's got to be a team. We ended up getting 25 others other than my family. And they were so excited about the opportunity to actually pursue the vision of the church, which is to plant a church. So that's how we ended up in San Jose. And then after about 3 years, this was about when I was about to turn 50, I kind of asked my wife, well, I don't know how much longer I got, so maybe would it be a good idea if we moved back to LA to be close to the seminary so that we could train up other pastors to church plant, as well as fill in the other churches that we've been planting. And to my surprise, the leadership in San Jose was very supportive. The leadership in San Diego was very supportive. And so I moved to LA. I had vowed I'd never go back to LA. Like, I didn't want to go back to LA. It was a headache just to go to LA. The only reason I went is because my parents lived there. But God was good to lead us there. The month before we left from San Jose, my associate who was supposed to take over, we found out that there were some kind of question marks and things, and that turned into this incredibly traumatic ordeal. And the last week I was here, I think I didn't sleep the whole week. We were trying to resolve this, and everything fell apart. All the carefully laid plans I had made, I thought I'd made the best plans possible to transition, and it completely fell apart. And I think one of the things I've learned about church planting is, like I said, at each church plant in San Diego, there was a very significant betrayal that happened there too, and in San Jose, and then even in LA recently. That's probably been the hardest part of church planting, in that, when you have a younger group, it tends to be a younger group of people. Most of the older folks don't want to have to uproot transplant, especially if you have kids. It's rare to find families who are willing to do that, which is just a reality. And I understand. My family suffered a lot. We never had enough youth. My kids were the youth. And so, that was probably one of the biggest... I think it took me almost to a similar place where I was so crushed. But I remember my time in Maryland, and I said, I never want to go back to that again, where I turned so dark. I literally would just walk away from people. I wouldn't even say hi. I just had a tremendous distrust of everybody. But that really was more of a distrust in God. I look back and see that I had so overreacted to everything. I felt like everyone was a potential enemy. And that's a terrible way to live, And so, but it was very humbling to go through these very difficult situations. And there's one passage, I was going to try to talk about it during the sermon, but I didn't get to. If you have your Bibles, look at 1 Corinthians 11. And starting from verse 17, it says, but in giving this instruction, I do not praise you because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. Bless you. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you. And in part, I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Now, I've read this passage before, but I don't think it struck me as much until I went to a conference last year, a counseling conference, and the speaker actually addressed this verse on the topic of conflict. I wrote my dissertation, it's called a Peacemaking Primer for the Asian American Church, because for me, conflict has always been the biggest issue. And while conflict exists anywhere, obviously, and sin is obviously at the heart of all that, I wanted to address some of the nuances that come in an Asian American culture that may be complicated a bit. Even amongst Asians, we don't understand each other. I remember the first time I asked someone if they were Chinese, and they said they were so upset. They're like, I am Taiwanese. Don't ever call me Chinese. And I was like, I didn't know. For some people, it was that strong. And I have some now Taiwanese friends that told me, they are just, very, very gung-ho about all that. So I was like, oh, wow, even amongst Chinese, there's so many different strands of Chinese, So even Asians don't understand each other. Even Korea, the whole history of Korea in the last decade, the last century, it's one of division, right? It's north and south. In And then in the context of the church, like why are there conflicts? And I remember the speaker said, well, in part, God uses conflict to show who really belongs to him. Who are the approved? Who are in the ESV says genuine? Isn't that an interesting thought? And that's why for me, sovereignty plays a role in that God even uses conflict to show who are his. Now that's a tricky thing because it's not to say you're the one who determines who are the right ones. God is the one who reveals that. But the real question is, are you? Like, how does conflict reveal what you're about? Like, do you really want to glorify God? Dean said you guys have gone through the Peacemakers materials in the last few months. So, the 4Gs, remember the 4Gs, the Peacemaker Pledge. Glorify God, get the log out of your own eye, gently restore, go and be reconciled. Right? But that first G is the most crucial, glorify God. The one very, I think, elementary, foundational point is, do you care more about God's glory or your own? I mean, think about it. We're all inclined to pursue our own glory, right? Like we think we're right. We think everyone else is wrong. We think our way of thinking is the right way everyone else should follow. I mean, any of us can think that way. But do we actually truly want to glorify God? But do we even seek what that means? I've learned that glorifying God sometimes means, like in Romans 12:18, it says, as much as it's up to you, pursue peace with all men. So there are two things. Okay, first, as much as it's up to you. That means you better do as much as you can. But even your best efforts do not guarantee, right? As much as it's up to you. It doesn't guarantee that you'll accomplish peace or reconcile with everybody. But the one thing you can do is, did you do everything possible on your part? So did you get the log out of your own eye? Did you walk in the Spirit? Gently restore assumes gentleness as the attitude behind your pursuit of restoring your relationship, right? No one responds well to yelling. I mean, I don't know. At least in Korean culture, there's a lot of yelling going on all the time. Koreans are known for yelling, being very passionate. I grew up with that. It's like, why is everyone yelling? Especially at church. Like, why are they yelling? I can hear you. You're 10 feet away, but you have to yell. But gentleness. I recently spoke at a men's prayer breakfast for a friend of mine, and I just talked about the character trait of gentleness, undergirding all that you do. A gentle answer turns away wrath, right? Proverbs. There's something about maybe Asian culture, and I think maybe generally speaking, especially for men, I think gentleness is not valued as a very important character trait that you actually implement. For instance, with your children. Okay, I have 4 daughters. So the one thing I learned about having 4 daughters is how I say something matters. It could be true, it could be Bible verses, but how I say it goes a long way. Right? And it could just be slight. It could be slight. I truly have tried to never yell at my daughters. I have to confess I yelled at my dog. Okay? I have not yelled at my wife. Because I grew up with so much yelling, I really vowed I will do everything to not yell. But I did yell at my dog. And even our dog is half Chihuahua, very sensitive. So I've learned I have to watch how I say things to him too. But it reflects the filling of the Spirit, right? In Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit, and gentleness is part of that. So gently restore and then go and be reconciled. So part of our membership process, we ask the members to make that Peacemaker's Pledge. It's part of our membership process. And we say, you will be held accountable to pursuing peace. And if you don't, and if you rebel against that, you could be subject to church discipline. It's that serious. Now, some people leave the church, so they kind of discipline themselves out of the church, almost in a sense. But we still address it. But at a leadership level, I think this is the hardest part. When there's conflict amongst the leaders. I remember one of them saying, it's too hard. Peacemaker Pledge is too hard. I was like, of course it's too hard. It's actually impossible to do apart from the Holy Spirit. I don't do this because it's easy to, I teach the Peacemaker at least once or twice a year, or preach it on a Sunday. I go through it for the membership class. We have quarterly members meetings. I go through it. I briefly kind of summarizing it because I want to keep reminding our church, this is what we're committed to. This is what we're committed to. Because the one thing that will kill us is conflict. Very rarely are there those who have a doctrinal issue, because when we have our membership class, we say, well, look at our doctrine. If it doesn't match, then you should find a church that matches you. Philosophically, ministry, they kind of know what they're getting when they come. So if you don't like it, you don't have to be a member. But becoming a member, the biggest problem is going to be conflict, relational conflict. And it happens, all the time. Why? Because we're sinners, and we can be selfish. We can be short-sighted. We can take issues sometimes with the smallest things. I remember in San Diego, we finally were able to rent our own facility where it would be 24/7 hours. So we had to make choices like what color carpet, and what color chairs. And everyone knew I hated the color brown. I hated the color brown. It was because it was a traumatizing part of my youth. Okay, my dad got me a new car. It was new for me. It was my uncle's car that he had crashed on the freeway. It was a 1984 Thunderbird, brown on the outside, brown on the inside. It was the ugliest looking car, and it broke down all the time, so I hated that color. So we have this vote, and we ordered 2 samples. One was blue, one was brown. We had all the members actually try out the chairs, sit on them, see what they thought, and then we actually took a vote. And brown came in overwhelmingly as the winner. And I remember thinking, okay, do you pull the senior pastor card? Veto? No. No, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. It actually came in handy because brown is a great color that kind of absorbs all the stuff that gets spilled on it, right? But I realized something like that could just cause a conflict, right? But more often than not, there are offenses that take place between people or parties. And but this passage, Paul actually says, and if the context of 1 Corinthians 11, it's the Lord's table and the love feast. People are getting drunk there. They're not sharing their food. I mean, it's so sad. Imagine, I think we're having lunch afterwards, and say everyone brought food, but there are some people who didn't bring food, and instead of sharing, you're like, sorry, you don't get anything to eat today. And you go at church? Could that actually happen at church? And Paul's saying, I can't believe it. You guys are having factions and divisions over the Lord's table. I mean, someone's getting drunk. I mean, I don't know, they probably didn't use little sippy cups, those little communion cups then, but someone's getting drunk off a communion. So you're like, wow. So when he says, I do not praise you because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. I mean, I think that's a big thing that you should be thinking about all the time, but especially Saturday night as you prepare for church. Am I preparing when I go for the better or for the worse? What am I going to bring to the table here when I come? How do I contribute to the Lord being honored? I don't think people are always very purposeful in doing that. Some people, it's you barely get awake. If you're a family with little kids, it takes everything just to get your kids in the car, and get them to church on time. So everyone's already cranky, and you're hungry because you didn't get anything to eat. So there's so many things that go on. So I would say the bigger perspective is to be able to say, and not that it excuses anyone's sin, but when division happens and you see how people respond. And this is not for us to place judgment, it's to really make the observation, well, am I going to be one who responds as an approved one or a genuine Christian that loves Christ, that loves his church, and that I'll humbly do my part to pursue peace? Some people are very passive about that, so they just don't do anything. Well, that's not helpful. And some people just kind of get upset and they speak out and they cause more problems. Well, obviously that's not helpful either. What do I do? And Paul, what he's addressing as well. I mean, the Corinthians had all sorts of problems, right? In fact, in the very beginning, he says, some of you say you're of Paul or Apollos or of Cephas. Some of you even have the audacity to say, I am of Christ, right? They think they're the most spiritual ones. That's like at every church. And Paul's saying, no, this is not the way it should be. So conflict is really such a real issue. It'll be here with us till the day we die, until Christ returns. There will be conflict, so we just can't say avoid it. But the question is, if Christ himself walks into the church, who will be those who are the approved, the genuine followers who seek to honor him? In 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, when it talks about the body of Christ and spiritual gifts and so forth, and a lot of people get hung up on the spiritual gifts issue. But the bigger issue is you're members of the body of Christ. There's one body. There's one head. You're supposed to honor Christ. That's the point. You're missing the whole point by getting hung up on what gift you have and all that. Because the gift wasn't meant for you. It was to serve the body, to honor Christ. And so too many times we see churches that just and I think it's because each member has to take seriously that calling. This is the body of Christ. That's why I serve. That's why I give. That's why I fellowship. It's not, just for me. My third daughter, she's our princess daughter. She loved Disney. We go to the mall, just a window shop. She always wanted something, but I said, no, sorry, we don't have any money. But I get her the catalog, and I said, you could circle whatever you like. So she circled everything. Okay, good, all right, let's go home. But one day, I think she was 6 years old, I finally had to tell her, the world does not revolve around you. Life is not about you. And she was so crushed, because she really believed life was all about her, because she was the true princess of our family. And then I thought, that's not just for her, that's for me. 2 Corinthians 5, 14, 15, when it says, for the love of Christ controls us, knowing this, that one died for all, therefore all died. He died so that we who live would no longer live for ourselves, but for the one who died and rose again on our behalf. And that passage really became one of those life passages. I do not live for myself. I live for the one who died and rose again. And if everyone at the church really just kind of owned that, none of us do it perfectly, of course, but then that's what we bring to the table. We live for Christ. And then when we look at the opportunities that we have, even today I've had a chance to talk to some of you, and God has a way of knitting our hearts because of Christ. And he unites us in that. So anyway, I wanted to leave some time for questions or, comments, things you would like to ask.
So I want to understand your life a little bit, because in understanding your life, it helps me to understand other things about the church I'm interested in, okay? Mm-hmm. So I hope my questions will not stir and disturb you, because it's about your life.
No problem.
Sounds very interesting. So the way I understand it is that at first you served 6 years somewhere in LA, and you were really well supported. It was a Korean church, mm-hmm. run by FOBs, what do you call it?
First generation, yeah.
First generation?
Yes.
And they were interested in you being the children's ministry, or young adult, or young people's ministry. Was that mm-hmm. it? Youth ministry.
Yeah, I started off.
So you were really effective there, and they loved you, and therefore you decided to move to Maryland. In Maryland, there was also a first generation, mm-hmm. and they had plans for you to say in 3 years' time they want you to plant a church. And while you were there, you were also a ministry young people, right?
Yeah, we eventually developed at both places an English-speaking congregation. So
you did develop an English congregation in Maryland, but when you went there was no English congregation.
No. Yeah.
Okay, so you developed that, and you were ready to launch this English ministry elsewhere or within this context, within this, let's say, church. you started an English ministry and speaking congregation, and did they want you to move it out or stay within, like what we
Yeah,
have
so the
here?
plan was to actually go independent,
Uh-huh.
to move out.
Out physically as
Yes.
well as,
Right.
That was the initial plan that you were aware of, except along the way, they didn't want to let go.
Right.
Would you say that's the thing? They didn't want to let go, they somehow felt threatened, therefore there was this mess,
Yeah.
and you were in the midst of this mess.
Yes.
So this mess is actually what I have experienced in my life, and it really hurts, like you said. It really, really hurts, and you see all the conflict and all the fighting, and it hurts so bad. And each time, so my conclusion was, for myself, was that, you know, my husband and I wanted to do that, and it hurt, and we moved out, and we come to this church, and there was another different kind of mess. And then nothing happened. Okay, it just stayed as a, for me, sort of like stagnant, never grow into an independent English church. So I'm really sort of amazed that you took those hurt and then went to San Diego or wherever you landed. And at that point, your brother-in-law was already in an English-speaking congregation,
No.
Korean congregation,
No. He was just going to a predominantly like white Caucasian church at the time.
but he was serving
But
as
he
a
was-
pastor?
No, just as a lay person. He just had like a Bible study
Okay, so
that he was just investing in people.
but it was a white church and he was just part of the members, that's all.
Right.
Okay, so then he wanted you to, he motivated you, or he had dreams also to start a church, and that's the small Bible study, started with 15 and grew to
Right.
30, and this Bible study group was composed of new graduates,
Yes.
without family, and it was a Bible study, but they were mostly English-speaking Koreans or something.
Yes.
And then that started this church.
Yes.
And then later on, you somehow go from there to San Jose, and in San Jose, it was also a new graduates, young adults, and what, you started 15, 20, 30?
About 30 people.
And it's remained as a English congregation,
Yes.
even today,
Yes.
if it exists. Then you went from there to back to LA now,
Yes.
and you started another one.
Yes.
And again, this is similar to the one in San Jose. Okay. So the reason I'm very interested in this is, so someone gave me, my husband and I both want to start something with the English, seeing the need of the young people, and myself, personally experienced, like, I went to a Chinese church for my life. I can't understand. I couldn't even become a Christian until I went to a Bible study and I became a Christian. And then we started similar thing, and a similar hurt happened, and we just said goodbye to it finally. And the pastor who, he's a lay person who sort of also had that dream. He just died like 2 years ago. And when I met up with him just to say goodbye, he says, Marilyn, I think that dream it's just hopeless for the church to have that dream. We tried, and you've also tried to do something wherever you are, and nothing happened. I think it's just a hopeless dream to think that a Chinese church will have it. So the only one I know is someone says that his brother-in-law drives every week from San Jose to San Francisco. And there's one in San Francisco that's all run by American-born Chinese people. And so I just, I really was very touched by what you share, because then maybe ultimately I should have gone through what you did and joined that group, which is just forget the church attached to a Chinese church and just plant it. And that would have, it looks like that's the way to go in order for Chinese Americans to have a church. And then the second question in my mind is, well, it's never successful after 40 years. Maybe my goal in life was all wrong. You know what I mean? Maybe the second generation will just merge into the American church, because that's where I see them now. I've gone to several American churches locally. Maybe there's really, my dream of whatever it was my dream, but not God's dream, and I'm just wasting my 40 years, pursuing something that was nothing. But then today you come here and tell me you did this, and I go, wow, God, what's going on? What's this story that here's one person who actually you helped him, and he definitely suffered all the pains, and he also tells me that even within church, there are sufferings. I mean, suffering meaning all good Christian elders and leaders and deacons, they're still killing each other. And it just doesn't make sense, And so thank you for coming, because I feel maybe, I don't know what's going on with the Chinese, but it doesn't really matter what's happening. But at least I see that God is using you in some way to reach out to the Chinese young people. My thing is that there are a lot of young people who are in Silicon Valley who are pursuing education and money, and they feel emptiness, and the American church, some does fit in. They merge in, and some really don't. And maybe I don't know how you see that whole thing.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for sharing. I think it is hard. Maybe one perspective that I've kind of grown over the years is that even though I have my own personal ideas of what I would like to do, that's just part of the picture. Is there going to be a need still for like a first generation kind of congregation? Like, for instance, especially like say in a Chinese church or Korean church, you still have those who predominantly speak in that mother language, right? So, and the sermon, everything's in, like, say, Korean or Chinese and so forth. So, that is the dynamic where there's still a need for ministry. These people still need Christ too, right? But the complicated part is, well, what do we do with not only the second generation, but then, you got that 1.5 generation that don't even fit either way. So, there's so many complicated factors in church that make it, I think, very challenging, and I don't have answers for all of it either. All I know is, I just recently preached through Hebrews 11, and I wanted our congregation to get an idea of what does it mean to live by faith, by faith, all these, Old Testament figures that live by faith. And it says that, and they saw from a distance, they didn't even see what was promised. Like Abraham never inherited the land. He knew he had the promise, but he lived in light of the promise. Same with Isaac and Jacob. Like, they never actually inherited the land. And then, it ultimately points to the bigger picture where it's ultimately all pointing to Christ in a heavenly home. And so I thought, and this was maybe a number of years ago, I realized I might never see what I hope to be accomplished in my lifetime. But what I can do is keep living in light of that in whatever ways God allows me, because I can't even control my circumstances. But each life counts. Like, I know sometimes from maybe like an institutional level, we think about planting a church, and having an actual church built up. But yeah, that's so many people try to plant churches. So many have failed. Not just even in the Asian context, Asian American context, all across the board. So it's not just whether I feel like I succeed or not. I tell, especially seminarians, I'll tell them, I go, all I know is I want to live for Christ. And as I have opportunity, I will push for what I can. I'm the one that has probably like the kind of ideas that most people don't. And I'm just maybe I'm just dumb enough to try. Whereas some people say, like, I wouldn't do that. Like, it's too much risk. There's too much potential for hurt. Yes, very true. But I think without risk, then you don't make progress, right? I mean, so there have to be those who are willing, and not just pastors. I mean, we're talking about church members too. Like, are you willing to walk by faith and say, like, then together let's walk a step at a time, step by step, let's work towards walking by faith to see, Matthew 6:33, when it says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. And it's in the context of don't be anxious, right? Don't be anxious for even what you eat or what you wear, because God takes care of that. And I've learned that, like, I have to be patient with that process. I mean, I remember at elders meetings, even in the Lighthouse churches, almost all my ideas would get shot down. And I'd be like, well, guys, so what are we going to do? You're not giving any other ideas. You seem to find great pleasure in shooting my ideas down. Do you have any ideas? And they're like, no. I go, then what are we doing here, I go, can we try something? At least let's try. If it doesn't work, then okay, then let's try something else. But if all we do is criticize every idea, we'll never go anywhere. So, I can't speak on everyone's behalf necessarily, but I think this is where you pray. I think praying that God would be the one to do the genuine work of changing people's hearts. I think I've become a bit more patient now with, every time I church plant, everyone gets younger. So I get older and older, and they're younger and younger. Like, they're younger than my kids now even. Like even the other day, I met with like a 25-year-old guy. I mean, I am over twice his age, and he's like, he wants to talk 1,000,000 miles a minute, and I'm tired. I can't keep up, but I'm so encouraged that he wants to spend time. So I'll grab that, and let's build on that. And it might not be the grand plans that happen right away, but it's the discipling, life on life. And as God provides those opportunities, like I just met with someone yesterday morning for breakfast. He was kind enough to take care of our dog while we were gone on missions. So I thanked him, took him out to eat, but he's just sharing his life. He just started dating recently, and he's asking me questions and this, that. I love that. Every believer should be discipling, right? The Great Commission is not just for missions. It's for every believer. That's what should define the church. So when the church is committed to that, then I think God takes that, and maybe it becomes a church plant. Maybe it becomes something else. But without that, you can't go anywhere. So it's good to have a big picture in mind. Like, I'm the big picture guy. I always depend on others to help kind of flesh everything out. But the one thing all of us have to do, myself included, is, am I discipling, making disciples of Christ? That's the mission. And if I can do that faithfully, even if it doesn't amount to something huge, that's what I'm called to do. And so, I feel for you when you share that. It's hard to swallow that things are not happening. That's why I got very bitter and embittered too when I saw the things that happened. But then I realized all I do in getting bitter, they say like, bitterness is drinking poison, expecting someone else to die. That's really true. You're just drinking poison by staying bitter. I had to deal with a lot of bitterness in my heart, and then say, God, okay, I need to let go of that. I mean, even like I said recently, one of my closest friends, 20 years, just turned on me. And it was the most, he wrote me this scathing email, and I remember falling on the ground, just crushed, just weeping uncontrollably, and it's never been reconciled. He refuses to acknowledge he did anything wrong, and it's so heartache. It's such a heartbreaking thing, but okay.
So how do you deal with that? That's the other thing. And I assume he's a Christian too, right?
Well, I'd like to say so, but I'm not the one to finally judge on that. All I know is I have a responsibility to walk in a manner worthy of the calling, right? So if he's going to mistreat me or slander me or whatever, am I going to do the same, or am I going to be different? Am I going to honor the Lord? It's hard when people ask me, what do you think? I'm like, I don't know. I don't trust him. I don't believe him, but I can't control anything about it. So I need to not let that define how I think. I think sometimes we can get so hung up by our past that it defines, it's almost like the lens through which I see everything. So I've had to learn to get rid of that lens. It doesn't mean I don't care about it anymore, I do pray for restoration one day. It'll either happen in heaven or here. So one day it will. So I can trust that with the Lord. If I did as much as I could, Romans 12:18, and then I move forward. I mean, like you think about Paul and Barnabas, right? It says they had a sharp disagreement, and they went their separate ways. We don't have all the details of the story. We hope at some point that they reconciled, right? Even like John Mark, like he didn't want John Mark, that was the whole point, but then he affirms John Mark later. So we never know how the story will work out. We can trust that God will. And that's by faith. We trust that God will work it out. I don't know, but I don't want to live in bitterness. That's all I know. I want to be forgiving on my part. Now, I believe forgiveness, in order for it to truly be experienced, there needs to be a transaction that takes place. Like they need to ask for forgiveness. They need to acknowledge they did wrong so I can then forgive them. If they don't ask for forgiveness, then there's nothing happening. But I can still have a forgiving attitude toward them. In other words, I'm not going to hold it against them. I fight for that, and then I move forward. There are other lives, and it's not to be calloused. It's just to say, you know what? If these people don't want it, okay, then I can't do anything. But let's go on to the people that do, and then pour my life into them. That's been the amazing thing over all these years with the church planting. There's always a new group of people. Somehow God brings them. And then, a few months ago, a young couple came to our church, and they said, "Oh, Pastor John, is it okay if we call you John?" Like, yeah, I mean, it's okay. It doesn't matter. Really? Is it okay? Can we get your phone number so we can ask you questions? Like, sure. And they're like, "You're letting us have your phone number?" I'm like, this is kind of funny. Like, I'm just John Kim. I'm a normal person. But for them, they couldn't believe that they could have access. And I thought, well, that seems so silly. But for some people, they've never had that. So I just think if there's some way I can serve, even in the smallest ways, and we look for that, God is honored in it, And so when he says, what Paul says at the end of 2 Timothy, that he's finished the course, right? He's run the race. And all he's looking forward to really is he wants to hear, well done, good and faithful servant or slave. That's my life. That's what defines. I'm just here as a slave of Christ to do as he calls me, and then I can be content. And so, like even when you go through the doctoral program, even my girl said, "Do we call you Dr. Daddy?" Like, what are you talking about? I'm still dad. Other people would ask me that too, like, should we call you something else? And I'm like, that all that piece of paper means is I survived. Okay? Okay. Otherwise, yeah.
Speaking of which, Dr. John, you wrote on conflict resolution within Asian American.
Yeah.
Can you give us like a super high level, like what are specific conflict resolutions that Asian Americans may face that is unique as an Asian American, and maybe preventative measures?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, one of the things I do share is that, there is no like book that we read when we grew up. It's just like the way we grew up, right? So if you grew up with immigrant parents, there were unwritten rules about everything. When I went to a Korean church to serve as a youth pastor, I found out what the rules were because I broke them all. I didn't even know what they were. And I know it might be different in, say, the Chinese church, but in a Korean church, for example, if I meet someone who's older than me, okay, I am not supposed to initiate a handshake. I didn't know that. My pastor introduced me to an older pastor who was visiting, and he said, "Oh, I want you to meet this pastor." So I went, "Hello," like this, like any American would do, I guess. And the guy, I understand enough Korean when I know they're talking about me too. He's like, in Korean, he goes, "Who does he think he is?" And then in my mind, I was like, who does he think he is? I mean, all I did was hold out my hand. But I realized, and you don't look in the eye, you look down. And when you shake, you do a bow, and you hold your arm like this, and you do this. I didn't know that. Like, they didn't teach you at school. I've only found out because I didn't do it. I found out, like the first Korean church I served at, I was there 3 months, and then the elder who was overseeing me, there was only one other elder other than pastor, he took me out to dinner. I'm like, oh, how nice. Took me to this Korean Chinese restaurant for jjajangmyeon, right? Yeah, and then it's Korean style jjajangmyeon, right? So yeah, he takes out a piece of paper, though, before you eat, and it says, 40 things you've done wrong in 3 months. 40 things, and he's reading them all, and I'm like, what? And then I couldn't even eat. I was just like, I can't believe this, you know? Long story short, I found out that because I think culture can be so entwined with how they view their Christianity, the Confucian sort of, framework of top down, you don't question authority. Like I couldn't ask a question. Like to ask a question was sinful. For example, there was Korean language school after youth group on Sunday. So the kids were doing their homework during the youth group. So I'm like, what are you doing? It's like, we have to finish our homework. And I'm like, but why are you doing this now? I'm like, okay. So I asked the elder, I said, can we move Korean school maybe to Saturday? And he's like, why would we ask parents to drive their kids another day to church? And this is where my youthfulness kind of came out, a little rash. I said, what good is it for them to learn Korean and go to hell? Okay, now imagine saying that to an older generation person. So I got in big trouble. That elder left the church, came back a year later, and then we met up and he said he got saved. Oh, wow, all of a sudden everything made sense. He wasn't even a Christian. But see, how do you know that? So I think that's part of the challenge when you're in an ethnic church, especially at least within an Asian context, that it gets so entwined. And so positions of authority and leadership, it's more about like the position and power and decision making as opposed to, well, are they a 1 Timothy 3 qualified elder? Are they exemplary? Do they shepherd? So it's hard to know how to measure that. So, but I think a lot of that's reflective of how the culture actually is defining the relational dynamics. So I remember one elder telling me one day at this Korean church, he goes, recently I've been studying the Bible and it's been really good. And I was like, really? Like, shouldn't you be already? I mean, you're an elder. And he's like, for the first time, he said he's enjoying reading the Bible. And I was like, okay, he's a nice man, but you can't just be a nice man. You need to be a shepherd. You need to be exemplar. Like, you need to help shepherd the flock. So I think there's those unwritten rules that often define things that make it hard. So, but how do we talk about it? So when my dad got saved, I think that's what made such a difference. One of the first things he did is he asked me for forgiveness for being a bad dad. I couldn't believe it. Like, he never said sorry for anything. And then he started showing affection to my mom. That was a huge thing. I used to joke around and say, I never knew how I even got born. Because you go, like, I don't know. They don't even like each other. He would hug her and kiss her, and I'm like, that's weird. But I like it. It makes me happy to see that, because you just don't see that in Asian culture, right? They say that's a Western thing or American thing. I go, no, that's like a husband-wife thing. Like, you should show your kids that you love each other. You don't have to be gross about it, but you can just still show that, right? So I think there's certain cultural things that sometimes have dictated husband-wife relationship, parent-child relationship, and then that kind of rolls over into the church too then. So, I think that's probably one of the big things. I tried to do a lot of reading, and it was not necessarily always from a Christian perspective, but like the immigrant patterns and so forth. And you see this in other immigrant groups, and there are similar problems even within the church context too. The generational differences. So when you the second generation tends to leave almost every immigrant situation. Why? There are language issues, there's relational difficulties, and then they just want to get away. But my end of the second generation, I'm sort of on the older end of the second generation Korean. I actually see a lot of my friends going back to an Asian American or even an immigrant church situation because they want their kids to get back in touch with their heritage. And you're like, that's so weird, that they would actually consciously, it's almost like they're coming back. But it's still messy, it's still not easy. So what do you do with that? So there's still something about our ethnic cultural identity that pulls at us in ways that those outside don't necessarily understand. One of my Caucasian pastor friends, one day he said something like, "Why are you Koreans so messed up?" I was like, okay, that's messed up that you would just say that. Like, why would you say Koreans comprehensively are all messed up? Okay, yeah, we are messed up, okay? I say Korean churches take church conflict and splitting, they turn it to an art form. I mean, anywhere you go, there's not just one Korean church, there's like 3, but they came out of the first one. It's just it seems to be like what happens a lot. And that's sad that it's that way. So how do I now, as a second generation, instead of being embittered against the first generation, I think what I've learned to do more is to have compassion and say, you know what? They have suffered in ways that I don't even understand. And so instead of harping on why they're so different, can I maybe just appreciate them a little more? I might not still agree, but can I find ways to appreciate them? I tell my mom and dad, like, I think driving my kids to school alone, one day I went to my mom, I said, "Mom, I'm sorry. Thank you for all the times you drove me for everything." Like I would say, I need to be at school, some school event at 6 a.m. She never said no. My girls say, I need to be at some church or some school event at 6 a.m. I'm like, why? Like, do you need to go? Stuff like that, right? And I realized, wow, they were actually so devoted to taking care of us. They might not have done it always with the most God-honoring reasons, but I still can be thankful. So I think making the most of, everyone needs encouragement. Everyone needs to know that they're cared for, even the older generation. So if I, as the younger generation, can now come back around and say, you know what, thank you. Thank you for all that you've done. Build that, cultivate that relationship. And it doesn't happen overnight. So, yeah, I think that's one of the things that came out of my paper is just that the generational differences, the cultural, there's so many things. But as a Christian, I know where my foundation is, and I know where the core is, what defines me. So I can chip away a little bit at a time, and then I'll die one day. Hopefully I've discipled others then who will keep chipping away. And then one day we all get to heaven and we're good. Like, it's not going to get all resolved here. That's the point. So, but I want to point people to Christ. If I could be understanding, even just a little bit more understanding. So when I meet my Japanese friends, were you there when we went to the Japanese American Museum? Yeah. With Tommy Doe, right? Yeah, and I remember going there thinking like, oh my goodness. I mean, I knew about the internment camps and all that, but he got so emotional, the guy who was leading us, and I realized, wow, for him, he went through something I don't even understand. And you go, wow, if I'm so hung up on just my own situation, I don't realize that there are others. Like, am I even conscious of that? So instead of us all being so divided about me, Christ is truly what will unite us. Right? So that's why at our church, when I see not just Korean people, but Chinese and Taiwanese and Japanese, and the second daughter married a guy from the Czech Republic. So he's very, very bright white, very pale white. Our grandson is the cutest thing ever. Yeah, he's right here. Yeah, I have thousands of pictures. Hopefully, each generation, we let go a little more of all those secondary things, like the cultural things and the ethnic things. I love my son-in-law. His name is Vashek. He moved over to marry my daughter. He is the perfect, like, soothing, calm balm to my fiery second daughter. And, oh, I love him to death, you know. I don't care if he's Czech or not. It doesn't matter. He's a wonderful Christian. He loves the Lord. He loves my daughter. He's a wonderful father. That's more than I deserve. So my second daughter, she's walked away from the faith. It's the biggest heartache of my life. I meet parents who have that similar kind of thing happen, and you have to trust the Lord with that. She heard the truth from the womb. Went to the Master's University. She learned the Bible from John MacArthur. I mean, she had so many things that were to her benefit, and then she walked away from it. So that's why I know only God. It's only God that can truly change the heart. So we pray to that end for everybody. So when I hear you're sharing, there's heartaches, but we trust the Lord. And we live in a fallen world that still has all these issues. If you want to, you can watch my video podcast and just speed it up. You don't have to watch all 2 hours. You can watch it an hour at double the rate. But thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you here. So.
Can I ask you to close us in prayer, and then we'll head on over and grab some
Sure.
together?
Let's pray. God, we are so thankful that you are so patient with us. Even as Paul said, he is the chief of sinners. And if we are honest, we are the greatest sinners we know, because we know how sinful we are before you. We also know that we live in a fallen world, and on this side of heaven there will be conflict and hardships and difficulties and disagreements, and even in the church where sometimes it can be so discouraging. But I pray, especially for this church family, that even despite the hardships and challenges that they have gone through, and maybe even still are going through, that they would be reminded that Christ is still King. He still reigns over this church, and that there is always hope, even in the darkest of days, because we know that you are working all things together for good. And so even when we see evil, even as Joseph saw in his own brothers, he was able to know that you are working everything for good. So God, may we trust that as well, that you will accomplish everything for good. Help us to do our part to walk by faith, to walk in the Spirit, and to be faithful, to be obedient to all that you have called us to be, so that we would be instruments that you can use then to encourage and bless others. And then together, may we work toward the end where Christ would be the one who is magnified through all. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.